Pokrovsk. Before the war, most people outside eastern Ukraine had never heard of it, a modest industrial city in Donetsk Oblast with a pre-war population of around 60,000. But for nearly 2 years, it became one of the focal points of Russia's grinding offensive in eastern Ukraine. From early 2024 until late 25, Russian forces poured men, armor, artillery, and drones into the fight for the city, inching forward through minefields, trench networks, and relentless Ukrainian resistance. The advance was painfully slow, often measured not in kilometers but in meters. By the time Russian troops finally pushed into the ruins of Pokrovsk in December 2025, the battle had become a symbol of the entire war: massive effort, enormous losses, and painfully little strategic payoff. Because even though the Kremlin declared victory, capturing Pokrovsk didn't deliver the breakthrough Moscow had hoped for. Even after taking the city, Russia can't really do anything with it. Let's look at how Ukraine's counterattacks took advantage of Russian President Vladimir Putin's gamble and turned it into one of Kyiv's most significant battlefield successes. You see, while Russia was pouring resources into the fight for Pokrovsk, Ukraine had its eyes on something else entirely, halting Russia's advances along the rest of the front. Beginning in late December 2025, just as Russia was claiming victory, Ukraine started mounting counterattacks designed to exploit how many Russian forces had been tied down around Pokrovsk. Ukrainian forces recaptured approximately 115 square miles in under 2 weeks in February 2026, eliminating what amounted to nearly 2 full Russian regiments in the process. In contrast, Russia had been capturing around 70 meters, about 0.04 miles per day in Pokrovsk from February 2024 to January 2026. That's slower than the bloodbath Battle of the Somme in World War I. Furthermore, Ukraine has boldly claimed that the rate of advancement means that parts of the region could be called a grey zone where neither side can effectively exert any meaningful control. As soon as Russia makes an advance for one of the largest settlements in the region, Ukraine creates a counterstrike somewhere else to force it back. Basically, military whack-a-mole. For example, in Russia's Kursk Oblast, the city of Sudza became a brief but humiliating episode for the Kremlin. Ukrainian forces managed to seize the town during their surprise cross-border offensive in August 2024, exposing just how vulnerable Russia's own territory had become. Moscow eventually recaptured Sudza in March 2025 after a major counter-offensive, but the episode shattered the narrative that Russia fully controlled its own border regions and forced the Kremlin to divert troops and resources away from the Ukrainian front. According to multiple military analysts and geolocated battlefield footage, the Kremlin is not only losing ground, but also the information war against its own command structure. Its field commanders are routinely reporting victories that don't exist to superiors, who then allocate resources accordingly. This goes beyond the battlefield optics. Ukraine is operating as if it still holds a structural advantage, enough of one to sustain offensive pressure while absorbing Russian attacks. They're bleeding Russian formations at scale and also maintaining that tenuous but real edge along the front. For Kyiv, every counterattack, including the one in Pokrovsk, is also a political message that the war is not over, the outcome is not settled, and Ukraine's military has not given up the initiative. Now, Pokrovsk isn't just any Ukrainian city. Before the war, it was one of the critical hubs of Ukraine's eastern logistics network, including a rail and road intersection that provided supplies across a significant portion of the Donbass front line. Western analysts, Ukrainian commanders, and Russian planners alike understood what taking it would theoretically mean. A chokehold on Ukrainian resupply routes, a potential cascade of pressure on adjacent positions, and a genuine strategic foothold. In short, Pokrovsk was exactly the kind of objective that was supposed to justify the losses Russia was absorbing to get there. But what Russia's military got was a ruin of a city instead. Ukrainian forces had spent years rerouting logistics, hardening alternative supply corridors, and preparing fallback positions. By the time the Russian boots were walking through what remained of the city, its strategic value had largely been engineered away. All Ukraine lost was a former logistics hub, emphasis on the former. 3 years and hundreds of thousands of men the Kremlin expended chasing a target that kept moving. And that is perhaps the most damning summary of Russia's entire war effort. By the time they got there, the thing they wanted was already gone. Russia's failure to capitalize on Pokrovsk didn't happen in a vacuum. When you go over the broader implications of attritional warfare that went on during 2024 and 25, it seems obvious that Ukraine could only enjoy a limited success in stalling the Russian advance. Again, it seemed obvious. After all, Ukraine was fighting an opponent that on paper had the advantage in sheer numbers. Russia started the war with more soldiers in the field, more armored vehicles it could deploy, and a far larger defense industry capable of producing the consumables modern warfare burns through at staggering rates, especially artillery ammunition. But those advantages translated into painfully slow progress. By early 2026, Russia had already suffered an estimated 250,000 fatalities across the entire war, yet its offensive still produced only marginal gains. Pokrovsk became the clearest example. Enormous resources spent, massive losses absorbed, and in the end, little more than a ruined city to show for it. For Moscow, the message carries a very different weight. Putin's political identity and his entire justification for power, at least for the last 4 years of economic pain and the million casualties Russia accrued over the course of the war, have been built on a promise of decisive victory. The original objectives were the capture of Kyiv, the dissolution of the Ukrainian government, and the effective reabsorption of Ukraine into Russia's sphere of influence and perhaps the Federation as a whole. But every day that passes without those objectives being met is a day that the narrative frays a little further, and the harder it becomes to sustain that narrative abroad, the more effort the Kremlin needs to expend to maintain the propaganda of false victories and territorial claims over square miles of farmland in rural Donetsk. What's more, Russia's efforts to send enough troops and munitions to the front require an enormous investment in infrastructure. That infrastructure is beginning to crack in ways that will be very difficult to reverse. Russian Railways, known by its acronym RZHD, is the state-owned monopoly that moves approximately 87% of all Russian cargo. It's the backbone of a country spanning 11 time zones and, by extension, the backbone of Russia's military supply chain. As of early 2026, RZHD is carrying nearly 4 trillion rubles in debt, which comes out to approximately $52 billion. This is the corporation's biggest crisis in 16 years. The company posted a net loss in 2025, its first in 5 years. Its cash reserves collapsed 12-fold, from 251 billion rubles to just 21 billion rubles. It's been forced to send workers on unpaid leave, has begun laying off staff, and has cut its investment program by a quarter. The Russian government even went so far as to order the emergency sale of a 62-story Moscow skyscraper that RZHD had purchased just 2 years before in 2024. It's basically a garage sale to try to make up for the huge economic loss that the company is operating under to meet the government's demands. Thus, the backbone is broken and the pain is being felt elsewhere, including the battlefield. Since 2022, military shipments have been given priority status on the rail network, which means commercial cargo has been crowded out, a move that has also tanked the revenues RZHD depends on to service its debt. Freight volumes fell 4% in 2024 compared to pre-invasion levels, a 15-year low, and kept falling at an accelerated rate of 6.7% through the first 9 months of 2025. Roughly 200 trains are cancelled every day because RZHD is short 2,500 drivers and 3,000 locomotive crew members, and the company's 2026 budget has already been cut by 20% compared to the year prior. While RZHD is free-falling, the Russian government is busy trying to keep it alive. Pre-war, RZHD's revenue accounted for 2.5% of Russia's GDP, and now it depends on the state trying to prop it up through forced loans, cash infusions, or debt write-offs. It's literally too big and too important a company to fail, and Putin and the rest of the leadership know it. And the supply chain problem doesn't end at the rail network. Russia's civilian aviation sector is collapsing as well. Following Western sanctions, Russian airlines were cut off from the global supply chains that kept modern aircraft flying. According to one source, more than half of Russia's Western-built fleet could be grounded by mid-26 due to spare parts shortages. Airlines have resorted to cannibalizing functioning aircraft to keep others in the air, a practice known as parts harvesting that is both dangerous and self-defeating, since every plane you dismantle is one less you can restore. Volga-Dnepr, one of Russia's major cargo carriers, transferred 8 aircraft to Aeroflot in a deal that was essentially an admission that those planes could no longer be maintained as independent assets. Russia had ambitious plans to replace its Western-dependent fleet with domestically produced aircraft. Production numbers have consistently fallen short of announced targets. Remember, in late 2023, the Kremlin came out with a bold claim that it would add 1,000 aircraft to its commercial fleet by 2030. Instead, the factories produced only 5 new aircraft in all of 2024 and 25. The goal was quietly revised mid-2024 to reflect smaller production, and even that was not enough. After what seemed like abject failure to keep any kind of domestic capacities, the plan was unceremoniously shelved mid-2025 and never revisited by Russian media. The airplane production industry isn't the only one in Russia that's failing. If you want more details on how the other Russian industries are faring, then make sure to subscribe to the Military Show, where we bring you the latest analytics and real-time updates. Returning to the collapse of their transportation industry, Russia is a country that spans 11 time zones, with roughly 5,000 miles between its western and easternmost points. Removing both forms of reliable fast travel means that Russian citizens could be left to fend for themselves. With a lack of fast, reliable ground or air transport, they might find themselves stranded in some of the most inhospitable regions in the world, both geographically, economically, and geopolitically. Because after all, economic sectors are being drained to divert funds to the war, so the only way forward is to join the army and be deployed to Ukraine. And that might not be the only summertime destination Russian soldiers could be expecting in the coming years. According to Estonia's Foreign Intelligence Service, whose 2026 annual assessment is considered one of the most reliable, open-source analyses of Russian military capability, Russia produced approximately 7 million artillery shells, mortar rounds and rockets in 2025. That's more than 17 times the roughly 400,000 rounds it was producing annually in 2021, just before the invasion. This is supplemented by an estimated 5 to 7 million rounds imported from North Korea and Iran since 2023, with North Korean ammunition accounting for roughly half of Russia's artillery expenditure on the Ukrainian front in the second half of 2025 alone. But there's a particular part of the report that makes this number strategically alarming rather than just impressive. Russia is not spending all of it on Ukraine. The Estonian assessment explicitly notes that Moscow is replenishing strategic reserves that were heavily depleted in the early years of the war. In other words, Russia is producing ammunition at a rate that exceeds its current combat consumption. Does this mean they're stockpiling for something beyond the current front? NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte might think so. He has said plainly that Russia is producing more ammunition in 3 months than all of NATO produces in an entire year. Germany's Defense Minister Boris Pistorius described Russia as having fully transitioned to a war economy, one geared not just to sustain the Ukraine campaign, but to prepare for what comes after. When you combine that production surge with the fact that Russia has made essentially no meaningful territorial progress despite this ammunition advantage, that's a troubling trend. If you're producing at those levels and still losing ground or stagnating, where exactly is all of that firepower going? One explanation is waste and corruption. It implies that Russia's documented logistical failures mean vast quantities of supplies never reach the front effectively. But the other explanation, one that the Estonian intelligence service offers, is a more alarming interpretation: that Russia is highly likely preparing for a future conflict even as its war against Ukraine continues. And this is where Russia's strategic picture becomes genuinely contradictory. On one hand, the Kremlin is running its defense industry at wartime capacity, accumulating ammunition at a rate suggesting preparation for a larger conflict. On the other hand, the economic foundation beneath the war machine is visibly crumbling. Western sanctions have cut Russia off from the technology imports needed to sustain advanced manufacturing. Russia's GDP growth has slowed to an estimated 0.6% to 1% for 2025, down from 4.3% in 2024, which basically implies that the country is fully in a wartime economy and needs to end the war successfully to start growing again. Then there's, as always, China. Russia is increasingly dependent on China for everything, from semiconductors to industrial inputs. This dependency gives Beijing substantial leverage over Moscow, allowing Beijing to dictate the price of Russian oil and gas, which are some of the most substantial sources of income for the country. This leverage has also grown to geopolitical influence, where China is essentially using Russia to manipulate Western institutions and lower NATO's own influence in key areas vital for China's trade, such as the Middle East, Africa, and Southeast Asia. So Putin has made Russia into the same kind of puppet state that he wanted to create in Ukraine, but it took a few years for the rest of the world to catch up to that fact. All of this leaves Putin in an exceptionally dangerous corner. The original strategy of swift decapitation and absorption basically failed in the first week. The currently running attrition strategy, where the goal is to grind Ukraine down and outlast Western support, has produced 250,000 dead nationwide and a transport system nearing bankruptcy amid widespread institutional failures. The propaganda strategy of telling Russians things are going well until they actually believe it is being undermined from multiple sides. Russian officers have run out of meaningful lies to tell, and it's quickly becoming clear that news of capturing a village doesn't bring cheers like actual progress. At the same time, Ukraine continues to debunk any reports of Russian advances in the region while mounting counteroffensives of its own. And the failures of Russia's military doctrine became obvious when Ukraine managed to take back the broader Kharkiv region within days in what amounted to one of the most effective and brutal operations since World War II, forcing Russian troops to scramble for their lives. So what are Putin's remaining options? Actually, the better question is, how dangerous are the remaining options? Unfortunately, the world needs to consider the dreaded nuclear option. The use of a tactical nuclear weapon on Ukrainian territory is not as unthinkable as it was in 2022, and that progression in itself is alarming. If you look at how Western militaries have started to regularly operate in the Middle East, most recently Iran, it's quite clear that conventional deterrents have a limited threshold where they're effective. And if nuclear posturing on one side wasn't enough to deter the US and Israel from going just short of a full-blown war with Iran, Putin might be next on the list to get desperate. So one option is limited nuclear escalation, with a small-yield nuclear device detonated on a Ukrainian military concentration, logistics hub, or symbolic target would serve several Kremlin objectives simultaneously. It would shatter Western public support for continued involvement, test whether NATO's red lines are genuine or symbolic, and give Putin a dramatic reset of the narrative after years of stalemate. The risks, however, are severe in both directions. A nuclear strike on Ukraine would almost certainly trigger a NATO response that could include the direct destruction of Russian military assets and the collapse of whatever remains of Russia's trade relationships with the global south. It would also cement China's discomfort with Moscow's unpredictability. Beijing has been careful to publicly oppose nuclear use in Ukraine, and a strike would force President Xi Jinping to openly go against the US in terms of nuclear weapons policy. More fundamentally, a tactical nuclear strike would not change the underlying arithmetic of the war. Ukraine would either capitulate to Russia, which is unlikely, or just keep on mounting more strikes to try to recoup the territory and continue receiving aid from NATO. NATO itself would likely never actually leave Ukraine, making it a martyr for a more aggressive deterrence policy where Russia itself gets nuked to prevent further attacks. This leaves Putin either dead or presiding over a nation that is economically and militarily broken and possibly losing some of its major population centers and military installations. The second scenario is stagnation, a deliberate decision to freeze the current lines, reduce active operations to a lower intensity, and spend the next several years rebuilding ammunition stocks, replacing lost armored vehicles, and quietly positioning for a future offensive at a greater scale. This is the scenario that worries Western military planners the most, precisely because it's the most rational option on the table. A multi-year pause would give Russia time to reconstitute the kind of armored strike force it lost in 2022, replenish its artillery reserves to levels that could sustain an opening blitz far more powerful than the one that failed at Kyiv, and wait out potential shifts in Western political will. The risks here are also substantial and are only made more problematic by the geopolitics involved. A frozen conflict requires Ukraine to essentially remain static while Russia rebuilds, which Ukraine has shown no indication of accepting. And perhaps most importantly, any extended pause will be interpreted by NATO as direct confirmation that preparation for a wider war is underway. After all, there's no reason to just stop the war and sue for peace when you're making more weapons for that same war. The third and most likely scenario is that we just keep seeing the same thing over and over again. Russia will continue launching small advances, just big enough to make headlines. Ukraine will launch more counterattacks. If one side shows meaningful weakness, we might see the war resolve itself in 2026, but we might also see the war stagnate without a meaningful resolution for years. And with each passing month, the internal pressure on Russia's government will increase until the system reaches a breaking point. When that happens, the military show will be ready to report, so make sure to stay subscribed for daily videos. And speaking of Estonia's reports, make sure to check out what Estonia is planning to do in the seemingly inevitable Russia-NATO war by watching this video. And thank you as always for watching.